Okay, this is our first book study class on the book of James that we are doing. For us currently, it's Lent. If you're watching this after the fact, it won't make any sense that I'm apologizing for having to cancel last week, but still, we had to cancel immediately before class, and I know that was a curveball. But we are going to go ahead and start with chapter 1 of the book of James. It has been my intention to take the 5 weeks, the 5 Wednesdays available to us in Lent, and to do 1 chapter per week leading up to Easter. We are now not able to space it quite so evenly. So we'll talk in a little bit, probably after the end of the class, how we want to handle that. But we're going to start with James 1, and the goal will be to get through the entire chapter with our class today. Some of this may be, because it's the first class, we are going to go basically line by line, at least in reading it together. In subsequent classes, if you will have read the chapter in advance, we can give a general discussion followed by whatever it is you want to talk about or bring up that has stuck out to you in your previous reading of the chapter. But again, this being the first time, I figured we would just assume either you have or you haven't read it recently, but we would do it together regardless. I think it's always worthwhile whenever we start a new Bible study class in particular, to just very briefly recap the reminder that the Bible is not written in English. So we all know that, but it bears repeating. So the Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew. There is some Aramaic, and the New Testament was written primarily in Koine Greek, and there is also a little Aramaic as well. There is some tradition that the book of Matthew was actually originally written in Hebrew and then translated into the Greek and then translated into the Latin and so on and so forth. But regardless, whatever version we're reading is a translation. And there is no mathematical formula for translating one language to the next. You are always going to have an incomplete transfer of thoughts from one to the other. There is no one-to-one word correlation where this word in Koine Greek means exactly this word in 21st century American English. Same thing with the grammar and the phraseology. It could be something like a saying that made perfect sense to somebody who read it 2,000 years ago, but we've never heard of that saying before. In the same way that you might go to a foreign country and say, you're pulling my leg, and they have no idea what you're talking about. The equivalent idiom in some Latin American countries is actually, you're drinking my hair. And that's weird to us, but it makes perfect sense to them.
What does it mean to them?
Like pulling your leg.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which again makes no sense if you don't understand the cultural context. There's nothing inherently funny or like tricking somebody by pulling their leg. It's just, well, it's an aphorism. It's just something that's kind of, we just say. Anyway, that is my preamble to say, feel free to use whatever translation you want. There's something interesting that can happen when we have multiple translations going, is that the slight differences in the translation can sometimes actually give us some neat insight into the intent of the Greek, because a translator is you have to pick and choose sometimes which of the possible things it could mean. And sometimes having a few different translations sort of covers the same ground that we would get from the original. And a slight turn of a phrase or a slightly different vocabulary term actually helps us understand the passage better than everybody being on the exact same translation. But it's really up to you. If you want to follow along, I'm going to be reading primarily from the New International Version, which is very readable. We have lots of copies around, but at any time, if you would like to be reading along or asking questions from a different version, then that's great, because it actually can spur some good discussion and occasionally some really interesting insight.
New American Standard here.
New American Standard is an excellent translation for trying to understand intent. It can come across as a little stiff and wooden when you read it, but it's a little more literal to the Greek grammatical construction. And so sometimes it feels sort of stiff because it's not the way we would write in English, but it's a little closer actually to the way the Greek is written. So it's an excellent translation for study, and it's a great one to have like when we're reading from a slightly different version. And if Bruce chimes in with something that, you know, let's listen and see how the pieces fit together. All right. I am going to read this out loud in chunks. And please feel free to follow along. We won't necessarily do this every class because we can read in advance and then just talk about stuff, but just to make sure. James chapter 1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be made mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. All right. So, first and foremost, anything that sticks out or any questions, and just in a general sense of that first paragraph that we read.
It kind of puts you in your place.
Okay, it sort of does, especially the way he ends, right? Where he, when you ask, don't doubt, and then just kind of deal with it. And if you're all mixed up about this, well, you sound like somebody who's not very stable.
Yeah.
He's not mincing too many words. And honestly, we will see this in James. James speaks with a plainness that is rather blunt. And it is not always, I'm not going to say not nuanced, but it can be kind of critical. It can be a little sharp. And there's a real emphasis in getting a point across rather than you feeling nice about the point that he's making. So let's give ourselves a little bit of broad context then, now that we've read this opening paragraph. The author is James, and he says that right off the bat, I'm James. The question is, which James?
Yeah. Because
in the New Testament and in the book of Acts, we have more than one to choose from. Generally speaking, scholarship and tradition suggests that this is James the Great. This is James of Jerusalem. This is James called the brother of Jesus. Now, for our Roman Catholic friends, I am perfectly content to concede that Adelphoi, brothers, can mean something broader in a familial sense than this like immediate family, sibling.
Yeah.
And for our non-Roman Catholic friends, I'm perfectly content to say that Jesus had brothers,
Yeah.
like sibling brothers. To me, it doesn't matter that much. I think there is every reason to believe that James is related to Jesus, whether it's super close or it's, one removed, because of the stature that he seems to hold, especially in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. And that kind of makes sense. If you're not one of the apostles, if you're not like James, the brother of John, which this is not, then why would anyone care so much about what you have to say? Well, it would make perfect sense then. If you were the brother of Jesus, you would very easily, kind of assume sort of a position of authority within the early church.
You would assume that when he was picking this crowd, he would pick people he trusted.
Sure, that he trusted, right. You know, and it was strangely enough, the one time that we can kind of think that James was alluded to in the Gospels by Jesus, except but not by name. Remember, he's being questioned and doubted.
Yeah.
By his brothers,
Yeah.
and he says, "Well, who is my brother? Those who do the will of God, you're all my brothers." So, and again, it's almost kind of a Pauline story, you know, not necessarily a persecutor, but a doubter, and a doubter in the family. And if that's the person who comes to a saving faith, then that's a pretty big transformation.
Oh, when you think about two little kids growing up, and all of a sudden now he's a big guy.
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm just saying this, it's not super significant to me, but if anybody has questions. The traditional Catholic understanding is the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is why they would reject the notion that Joseph and Mary were the parents of siblings of Jesus. And we're not going to go into why that's significant in Catholic doctrine, but one of the workarounds in tradition is to say that it's very common for older men to marry younger women. That Joseph was quite possibly an older man marrying a younger Mary, and he had been widowed and had older children.
Catholic.
So that would be the, you know, brothers and sisters parts that Jesus can refer to, though they are, you know, in essence, I don't know if we'd call them step brothers, but, you know, as far as the natural family is concerned, the only familial relation would be through Joseph, the adopted father, in essence, of Christ. So that does that pretty well characterize the Catholic point of view? Yeah. And again, this is not a make or break thought for me, but I thought I'd toss that out in case that, well, I heard that's kind of where I think we are with this. The canon of scripture, what the early church recognized as being authoritative, is a process. What they refer to as the canon doesn't close until early 3rd century, but extremely early on, this letter from James was accepted by the early church as being authoritative. They thought this was super significant and super important, and it was being spread, it was being proclaimed, it was being taught. A lot of scholarship places James, if not the very first epistle written, right there near the earliest of the written accounts, in its style and the things it talks about and the things it doesn't talk about. Sometimes you can date the epistles based off of things that, say, Paul might reference. You know, if he references himself being in prison, for instance, then you can kind of date it. If he doesn't, then you can kind of date it. If he says, I'm headed off to Rome, you can kind of see how late that is, you know, so on and so forth. So
if somebody talks about the destruction of the temple,
if they talk about the destruction of the temple, then
right,
like as if it already happened, then you know that it's pretty late. It's going to happen after AD 70. If they refer to it as something potentially coming, then it could be prophetic. But yeah, there are context clues that allow us to take some of these works and try to narrow down when we think the work. None of these are like written with a date on them. Like, I, James, am writing on a Tuesday. It's not like that, but we can, you know, based off of some extra biblical material, based off of the number of copies, the date in which it's referred to from other writings that we have. And again, some of the stylistic stuff can kind of narrow down where we think this was.
People that mention, you know, important people that they mention.
Right. And that's one of the ways that we get what the early church considered scripture, by having some of these extra biblical writings. You know, somebody from the late 1st century, early 2nd century, somebody like an Irenaeus or a Clement, who are then writing to the other churches, and they're referencing, they're quoting something from one of these epistles, Well, that's pretty good evidence that the early church thought that these things were super important. So that being said, the reason that I thought James was particularly good for Lent is James is kind of understood as the faith and works epistle. That will be a phrase that actually comes up almost as a quotation here, but it's not just a singular quotation. So much of the sort of perspective underlying James's epistle is the practical consequence of our faith. That what we say we believe ought to be evident in our behavior and in our lives. And here we are in this first paragraph, and I think we're already getting a little bit of that perspective. Now, he is writing to the 12. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry. I just referenced very obliquely Acts chapter 15. So this is the great debate about Gentiles becoming Christians. In the earliest church, the first Christians were Jews who found in Christ the promised Messiah, and they did not see this as a conversion from Judaism to Christianity. They saw this as the natural fulfillment of what all Jews were waiting for. But as the gospel spreads, you have non-Jews who are coming to hear the good news and wishing to respond. That becomes a particular focus of the ministry of Paul. But then the early church has to figure out what to do with that. Some leaders argue, no, the Messiah is a Jewish Messiah. You can't have him. Others argue, okay, but in order to become a Christian, you must first become a Jew. So you have to adopt everything of Judaism, and then its culmination is found in Christ the Messiah. And then the third perspective was, no, the gospel is good for anyone and everyone, no matter who or where they are, and they can approach Christ as Jew or Gentile without having to necessarily change to either one. This debate comes to the early church, and a council is called. It's in Acts chapter 15. It's referred to as the Council of Jerusalem. And this has been the pattern. This is why it's so cool. This has been the pattern of every sense of ecumenical council throughout church history. It's based off of what happens in Acts chapter 15. We don't know what to do with this. Therefore, we're going to call all the leaders of the church, and we are going to pray and invoke the Holy Spirit. And the same God who promised to lead us into all truth will lead us together into this truth. And the ruling is made by James. James, who says, no, you don't have to convert to Judaism. The gospel is good for everyone. Now, he wants the Gentiles to adopt, it's kind of a little bit of a compromise here. He wants them to adopt a few simple things, like if don't eat the strangled animals kind of stuff. But this is a determination that then shapes the course of theology of church history from there on out. And it is James who is in a position of authority within the Council of Jerusalem. And again, most tradition of scholarship points to that's the James we're talking about. All right. He's writing to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. What does that mean?
Well, we all know there were 12 tribes, but
Right. So this is a somewhat poetic way to
Yeah.
refer to Jews, to all Jews everywhere. And over the centuries, they've been conquered, they've been taken off, they've drifted away, they've dispersed. The diaspora is the spreading of Jews throughout that region of the world. So why then do you think he's writing to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations? What's the purpose of this?
Bringing them back.
Okay, bring them back, bring the gospel.
Mm,
but they're the ones dealing with the Gentiles.
They're the one dealing with Gentiles. Yeah, I think it's all of these things. But I think there's something, the underlying theme in this and I think this is also a reason to date this rather early, I think there's kind of an implicit to follow Christ is the logical and theological fulfillment of Judaism. And so he is writing to a primarily Jewish audience. He's not writing to all the Christians in Rome, or the Christians in Rome and everywhere. He's writing to the 12 tribes scattered amongst the nations. So that the people who will respond to the gospel first are Jews, but not all Jews live in Jerusalem anymore. Not all Jews live in Judea anymore. So this letter can be sent out to Jews to hear both the word of the good news, but those who have heard the good news and are responding to it, how then ought we live? So this is instruction to Jews anywhere who have come to know Christ as Messiah. All right. Greetings. Consider pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. Yippee! I love to be on trial. So this is maybe giving us a hint about some of James's perspective from the get-go. Why should we consider trials joyful? In general, this is not like going to court trial. What is a trial? I mean, it's some kind of hardship. Well, I mean, it could be a literal like courtroom trial, but we consider a trial like any kind of extended difficulty that we have to endure for some reason or no
You
reason.
may be picked upon by your neighbors because you're not
Yeah, picked on.
doing something in the temple and.
Right. So remember early on
Or
in Acts, as we're looking at the early church and the first Christians, they're getting drummed out of the synagogue.
Yeah.
Stop talking about this Jesus guy. Get out of here. Like, well, this is my home. Yeah, not anymore. If you have accepted Christ as Messiah, did every Jew around you? Maybe not. So then what happens and how do you deal with that? What happens when they're angry at you? What happens when they call you a sellout or you're crazy or you are a blasphemer?
and on the other hand, we can't go to the temple of Aphrodite and do business anymore.
You can't go to these temples because now these are pagan temples. All right, good. But to consider it pure joy, why? Because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So it sounds like we've got kind of like an equation here that faith plus the testing of a trial equals perseverance. Does that make sense to us? There is a concept referred to as, and I forget the author, I might have been a sociologist. Anyway, this is like the last 10 years or so. Really interesting concept to describe something. I mean, it's kind of always true, but it's just the description of it, I think, kind of struck me. Anti-fragility. Anti-fragility. Our culture right now is super safety conscious, and it's very twitchy. It's very nervous. The whole concept of like safe spaces, but also helicopter parents who demand that playground equipment be removed because my little darling might get hurt, where every child has to wear a helmet at all times, where no one can have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on a school campus because it might murder some student who's allergic to peanut. All of these sort of things are kind of interrelated. And the concept of anti-fragility is there are biological systems that when they are placed under stress, they don't get weaker, they actually get stronger. And part of what's happening psychologically in our culture is our response to the stressors out there. Kids on a playground, somebody saying a political opinion you don't agree with, peanut allergies, has become avoidance rather than working through it. And by avoiding it, you avoid the stressor. We're going to rip up all the playground equipment. We're not going to listen to political opinions we don't like, and nobody can have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We actually make ourselves weaker than stronger. If we will deal with the problems and then get through the other side, we're not fragile like glass, where if you smash it, it breaks and it's now broken beyond repair. We're more like muscle tissue or bone, that when you put stress on it, it responds to the stress and it actually increases. How do you make muscles bigger? You work out, you stress them out. And it's actually, you're actually creating, like if you lift weights or something, you're actually creating these little tiny micro tears in the muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue heals itself. And when it heals itself, it actually heals itself bigger and stronger. When you break a bone, it knits stronger in the place that you broke it. But if you will just move around and exercise, your bones will be stronger than somebody who always stays on the couch. The person who's always on the couch, their bones are actually more fragile than they would have been otherwise. So the anti-fragility says our response to difficult things shouldn't be to just avoid them. But when we go through them and understanding, we actually can become better and stronger by enduring it, by persevering, by making it through. Our immune system doesn't get weaker when it's attacked. It gets smarter and stronger when it encounters the pathogen. It develops antibodies to work against it. But if you never experience it, you will then be vulnerable to the first time it comes. So the trials of life don't sound particularly appealing, but what if that's the way we become stronger in our souls? And I think that's what's being suggested. You become stronger in your soul through perseverance in a couple of ways. What would you think? How would perseverance through a trial strengthen your soul?
Oh, just like one step at a time. Hey, I look behind you and you say, I did it.
Absolutely. So the encouragement to know I did it. I didn't think I could, but I did. And when the next trial comes, don't you feel better equipped? Don't you feel less anxious and worried, because now you've got some evidence to demonstrate that you can do this. And I would say that the other side of it is maybe even more significant. Look at what the Lord has done for me. I could not have made it through without God's strength and grace. He got me through something that I couldn't. But the same principle operates. So the next one that comes, even if I can't face it on my own, we now have evidence to demonstrate that God will see us through. So we can enter into the next trial and the next and the next with a confidence that we have been tested, and even where we lack, God is gracious. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. If you lack wisdom, ask God. He gives generously without finding fault. What will be given to you? So that confidence is also going to result in wisdom. How does going through trials, gaining that confidence, connect to wisdom in your mind? Because I think wisdom is more like, we think of that as a mental thing. So how we connect that to wisdom, maybe?
Connect with what?
Going through these trials, persevering, and it's, it's joyful because we've persevered. But it says, it's going to make us mature. It's going to make us complete, and then we will grow in wisdom. And if we don't have it, ask for it. God will give it to us.
We've done it. I can prove it.
Right.
I'm not a snowflake.
Yeah, you're not slow because, and again, it's the track record. So every now and again, I'll talk about the biblical nature of wisdom, this kind of Hebraic notion, and I've broken it down into like these stages, one that works into the other. And the first stage is like data. It's like a random trivia point. The average rainfall of the Amazon basin. It's just a disconnected point, and then data flows into knowledge, where the individual point starts having context. Like, I might know what the rainfall basin stuff is because I Googled it, but it doesn't mean I know anything at all about the Amazon, about rain, about topography, about geology, none of that. we have a lot of data these days. We have more data at our fingertips than at any time in human history. We don't have as much. Personally, I think our knowledge is lacking because we have almost no context for our data because it's taken no discipline to acquire it. That's the difference between, can you do your times tables or do you need a calculator? You can get the right answer on a calculator every time. And though our teacher said we wouldn't have a calculator with us at all times, our teachers were wrong. We do. But the difference between knowing a point of information versus knowing something about it, I would say, that's that data and that's the knowledge. And then finally, wisdom, the definition that I tried to work out was something along the lines of, like,
Don't touch the fire, because it will burn you.
not quite, but that's not bad. I had it written down once. I thought it turned out pretty nice, but something was like, godly knowledge applied rightly over time, or applied reliably over time. And so wisdom, the Hebraic wisdom was, it's not just that you understood a point, and it's not just that you understood the information around it with knowledge. It's that I could count on you to understand what it means and why it's important, because you had demonstrated it multiple times. The wise person wasn't the smart person. The wise person was someone who had done the right thing so many times in a row that everybody knew that the next time would be right as well. That's wisdom. So if you have, in this sort of framework, if you have a great moral quandary, you don't ask the academic philosopher. You ask the good man, whether he's smart or not. But has he demonstrated over a lifetime making the correct godly choice? That's wisdom. So we have to know something, but then we have to do the right thing with it and do it enough times where it becomes reliable. And I think that's Bruce's point, that in wisdom, we've persevered through the trial. We know we can do it. We know God will see us through it. And when it happens enough times, we not only have the information about it in a knowledge sense, it's the repeated reliability that makes us wise. I have a confidence in God seeing me through every day because he's done it so many times. I have a confidence that I can follow him no matter where he chooses to lead me, because he has been gracious and merciful so many times. But if we lack it, ask God. He gives generously without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And that's a good thing to know. We have it on good authority that if we ask, it will be given to us. If we knock, he's going to answer. When you ask, you must believe and not doubt. Here's the one that you liked, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything of the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. That sounds a little unkind or unfair. What do you think is the issue here? What is James wanting us to understand?
No, in one sense, it's like the publican and the taxpayer in front of the temple steps. The humility wins out over the
Okay.
braggart.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely. And when we are asking, but we're asking kind of, well, this probably won't work, but,
Yeah.
well, why would it then? If you've ever had somebody ask your opinion about something like, this is really, really important, and I probably won't do what you say, but give me your advice. How would you respond to that? Well, why do you want my advice then? What's the point of that?
Forget about it.
Right? So if we will seek God with earnestness rather than hedging our bets. Well, yes, I would like to ask you, but you probably won't let me know anyway, and this is probably not important, so what's the point? Okay, what's the point indeed? And that is somebody who does kind of feel like a wave, and they do feel kind of unstable or even double-minded. All right, let's take the next section. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossoms fall and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Humble circumstances, just like Bruce mentioned. But here's an interesting little juxtaposition. Believers in humble circumstances take pride in your high position. What high position does a believer in humble that didn't we just contradict ourselves? The rich should take pride in humiliation. Who should be prideful about being humiliated? This is unless, like Bruce says, here's the Pharisee and the publican. The publican who says, who's down on his hands and knees, won't even look up. God have mercy on me, a sinner, versus a Pharisee who says, thank you, God, I'm not like that loser over there. Taking pride in our low estate is not taking pride in us. It's taking pride in what God has done for us. In a humble circumstance, you have very little to point to say, I'm so awesome. So any awesomeness that you possess is very clearly the gift of God. Be proud of that. Be proud that no matter what your circumstances are, God has raised you up and glorified you through his gracious love. And if you're a rich guy, you can even take pride in understanding that what you have will pass away. Because the temptation of the rich is satisfaction and stuff. And I've known a couple of rich people who just didn't really care that much that they were rich, other than it allowed them to, they were very generous. They used it very freely, but they didn't get hung up about it. It wasn't a sense of their self-worth. And if you have a clear mind about that, I think that's something to be thankful for. Thank you, God, that you have not let me be consumed by the stuff that you have given me. And that might feel a little humiliating, but it's actually a blessing to kind of be put in our place, to have the proper perspective that no matter how much stuff you have, that part's not the important part.
And the joy of having all that stuff and knowing how to give it away.
How to give it away. And where it comes from. It doesn't come because you're so spectacular. God has chosen to bless you in this particular way for whatever reason. And again, it becomes less self-centered and more God-oriented.
Yeah.
This stuff is gonna moth and rust, will consume and destroy. It will wither and fade. So you don't put your heart in the things, you put your heart in the giver of all good things. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, having stood the test, you will receive the crown of life, the Lord promised to those who love him. And I think that's just but nicely worded, but not necessarily a happy thought that presupposes we will have to endure trials. And while I don't necessarily like that idea, I resonate and understand that idea. I have yet to be able to avoid hard things in life. And I'm not sure I could if I tried a little harder. And this feels very honest to me. To follow Jesus is not taking the easy path. And it's not calling down blessings to prosper ourselves. But it's trials, it's difficulties, and it's persevering through in which the promise is fulfilled. We love God, and yet we suffer in this life. And those two things actually fit together. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. This is a super illustration. First of all, This is a good, nice, practical theological point. Don't say God is tempting me. Why? Why shouldn't we say or think in such terms?
God doesn't tempt them.
Yeah, God is not the one making you churn on the inside. Should I do the right thing or the wrong thing? Do you think God tries to set us up? Oh, I'm gonna give them this really nasty, enticing option just to watch them squirm. No. I mean, life is out there, the world is out there, the brokenness is out there. God is not actively trying to dangle stuff in front of us to see. He's not trying to entrap us like a police sting. You know, this is not the way we ought to think. And maybe the biggest reason we ought not to think that way is it tries to absolve our own responsibility. So entrapment, I think, is an interesting parallel to this. The legal concept of entrapment is the police are allowed to pretend and to lie and to go undercover and to set you up, basically, but they have to demonstrate that you were willing and interested in committing the illegal act outside of them making you do it. If they create every element of the crime and sort of trick you into participating, you can rightly call that entrapment. I wasn't going to commit a crime. I didn't want to commit a crime. All of a sudden, you've done all this around me and then said, surprise, you're guilty. And that's illegal. So I wasn't even thinking about committing a crime. I don't even like to commit crimes. I don't even like this thing. That is the perspective that absolves the responsibility of the accused party. Like I don't want to do anything with drugs, or I don't want to do anything with stealing cars, but you know, this guy, he kind of strong-armed me into it, or he kept pushing me, and I was just trying to play along because I thought I was going to get in trouble if I didn't, but I was minding my own business. If we see God in those terms, I think it encourages us to continue to sin because it's not really our fault. You know, God put this in my path. Who am I to stand in the way of that? You know, I can't possibly. No. God's not doing this to you. You're doing this to you. Here's my little spiritual warfare aside. I am perfectly content to believe in a malignant spiritual reality that desires bad for me, my corruption, my destruction, everything else. I don't need to think that there is a specific personal demonic force actively trying to work on every little bit of my life, because whether that's true or not, because I am perfectly capable of screwing up my own life. Thank you very much. I actually need very little help. I can completely make the wrong choice all by myself. And I think this is what it's reminding us of.
The devil didn't make you do it.
The devil didn't make me do it. Whether or not the devil is a part of enticing, setting up, encouraging, nudging, whatever, it's always going to be me that does the wrong thing if I do the wrong thing. Yep, and this is, here we are. But now, here's this great metaphor. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So the enticement is not coming externally, like undercover cops trying to, get you to be involved in a drug deal. I'm the person getting myself in trouble. My own desires, my own hungers, my own appetites, my own interests are the ones getting me in trouble. And if I'm being dragged away by anybody, you know who's dragging me? I am.
Yeah.
I am. But this is boy, 15 is like, this is a sermon illustration that any preacher would have been proud to have written. After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when full grown, gives birth to death. Here's the cycle of life. And this very poetic, but very I think, very practical way. Our desire conceives. It generates, it creates this new life, but this life is sin. It's our wickedness, it's our bad behavior, it's our malevolence, it's our turning away from God, it's our wandering away from each other. And that sin starts off as a little baby, but it grows up. And when that baby grows up, it grows up into our death. Don't be deceived, brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. There's a really nice parallel. Remember, our desires conceive what? Our human, fleshly, sinful, broken desires conceive and generate and create sin. Sin grows up into death. God, however, gives birth through the word of truth, that we might be the first fruits, the initial harvest of what he's created. So there's a cycle of life and creation and birth on both sides. One of it leads to our death, and one of it leads to our life. But another beautiful and poetic phrase, right? Every good and perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of heavenly lights. Who does not change like shifting shadows. What does that make you think of?
Running after stuff.
Running after stuff. Yeah. And you know, shadows are completely immaterial, right? And like, if I had a light above me and there's a shadow behind me, I mean, I could move and the shadow will move. You can't grab it. It's insubstantial. It has no weight. But it takes nothing to get it to move. Because, I mean, all I have to do is shift a little bit, or, you know, if it's from the sun, as the sun moves across it. But remember, if this is not pushing the metaphor too far, a shadow is simply the absence of light.
Yeah.
The blocking of light. Something is in the way, blocking the light from reaching some spot. That is not God. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. And there's plenty to unpack here, but it's super practical. What do you catch from these? It's just a handful of verses. What do we take from this?
Say, we have a lot to learn about ourselves.
We do have a lot to learn about ourselves. Here's this practical stage.
Yeah, that's why we have, I was saying that the Lord gave us 2 ears.
And one mouth.
And one mouth,
Yeah,
and there's a reason for that.
sure.
Listen.
Why is it that the people who have such little to say oftentimes speak so very much?
Because they have nothing to say.
So they have to say it over and over again, maybe. This is kind of just a conversational thing, but this often happens in like relationship discussions or whatever. Psychologically, it is so easy, and it is to some degree a discipline that we have to work on and maintain. When we're having a conversation with someone, are you listening to what they're saying, or are you formulating your response?
Very fun.
Because if you're thinking, oh yeah, that reminds me of a good story, or oh yeah, I need to say this about myself, or oh yeah, I need to say such and such. Are you really listening to the other person?
Yeah.
Not so much. Not so much. Do we want somebody to listen to what we have to say? Well, sure. We don't want them taking one word and then their mind wandering off to how they're going to respond. We want them listening to the whole thought so that we can kind of appropriately share and interact. But if we just want to get a retort in, or if we want to get our 2 cents or our response to make sure that we're not really listening very well. And that relationship is going to be impaired because of that. This is a little, again, a little, just like a relationship trick or a piece of advice. And I got this from an old martial arts instructor. I used to say to the adult class, when someone tells you something that you already know, resist the temptation to respond, I know. Why? Why would that be a good piece of advice?
Elevates you, but not them.
Yeah, it's sort of like, well, I need you to know that I'm not stupid. Or I need you to know that I'm smarter than you. Or I need you to know that you've not told me anything that I don't already know. He said the better response is something along the lines of either thank you or yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Now, when you say yes, you're right, or yes, I heard that, or something like that, you acknowledge that the person is telling you something potentially for your own benefit, but you have ostensibly no reason to cut them down or to put them in their place. Like, oh, well, don't think you're better than me. I know. Even when you're not being snotty, when you say I know, it can be perceived as snotty. And it can also very subtly, even inadvertently, put you feeling like you're above them. So instead of a reflexive, I know, if you will try a habit that's more along the lines of, well, thank you, or I think you're right, or yes, I've heard that. You kind of practice keeping each other on a more mutual level. And you reduce the potential for the adversarial, which doesn't have to be there. Again, slow to speak and quick to listen. By and large, we learn a lot more when we listen than when we speak, because when we speak, we're saying stuff we already know. Slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Is anger sinful?
No.
I would say no. Why?
Well, there's such a thing as righteous.
Righteous anger, righteous indignation even. Who showed righteous anger?
Jesus.
God shows anger in the Old Testament. Jesus shows it with the money changers. So it must be possible.
Yeah.
Am I good at it? No. I'm terrible at it. My anger is always mixed in with my own selfishness. It's not so much the anger that's wrong, it's the fact that I can't handle it. So here's an encouragement to not become angry, not because anger is wrong, but what does it even stipulate? Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Because when I'm angry, there's always an element of I've got some self-pity, I've got some pride involved, I've got some self-respect, I've got some indignation about how dare you do this to me, of all people, or whatever. And that's not so much the anger, it's the way that I'm using it, dealing with it, wielding it. It is a very sharp sword of a tool. And if you're not exceptionally careful, you could injure the wrong thing, and I'm just not careful enough. So get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. And there's that concept of humility. And I like the word planted in you. The word planted in you. Remember, just a few lines before, we're referred to as a first fruits. of what God has made. Here is that sense of God doing a work in us. Plants grow from seeds. The seed is planted in soil and then it grows. Don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Here's some of the most famous phrases of James.
Yeah.
Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues into it, not forgetting what they've heard but doing it, will be blessed in what they do. Don't be listeners of the word, but doers of the word. This is the old motherly distinction between listening and hearing. Your mother calls out, go clean your room. And her vocal cords vibrate, which vibrates the air, which vibrates your tympanic membrane, which sends those vibrations into your brain, but you never get up and you never go. You heard her, made a sound, it registered somewhere, but did you listen? Not if you didn't do what she said. And mom would say that. You didn't listen to me. Because we have the expectation that if you hear this, it will spur you to the proper action. And if action is removed from the hearing, you didn't really listen. What we believe and how we act ought to be inextricably linked. And if one of those pieces is missing, we can rightly question the other piece. And maybe it's not there after all, or maybe it's no good. We have to do what we read and what we know, and not just like listen to it and shake our heads. Like somebody who keeps saying when you're having a conversation and you realize after about the third they tuned out 10 minutes ago. You're like somebody who looks in his face in a mirror and walks away, forgetting what we look like. You ever do that? I do it every day. Because I look in the mirror, because I shave and all that kind of stuff. And I walk away and I'm 25 again. And my body is able to do all the stupid things I'm asking it to do. I look in the mirror and I'm 49 and running fast. And this hair is very gray. But I walk away and I'm like 24, 25, 26 maybe. Hale, hearty, and strong, and my hair is much, much darker.
Yeah.
Because we deceive ourselves, right?
Yeah.
I don't really need anybody to deceive me. I am excellent at deceiving myself, mainly because, why do you think we're so good at deceiving ourselves?
We don't want to think that's happening.
Yeah, we're so good at deceiving ourselves because we want to be deceived.
Yeah.
We're picking stuff that we want to be true and we know it's not. So we're exceptionally gullible to the things that we really want to be true. But
Which is why so many scams work.
yeah, well, that's, I remember watching a documentary with a con artist. And he said at the heart of every successful con is finding someone who wants to get something for nothing. Because if I'm trying to con somebody and they're not interested in getting something for nothing, I'm probably wasting my time and I move on to somebody else. I have to touch that nerve of greed, even in a good, normal person who's minding their own business. But if I can touch that point of, I can get something for nothing, well, then I can work with that. But if that button doesn't do anything when I push it, I just move on to somebody else. When we look intently at the perfect law, it gives us freedom. The perfect law is looking in the face of Christ himself. And remember that his burden is light. His yoke is easy. that's when we can not forget it, but do it and then be blessed because we did it. Those who consider themselves religious and yet not keep a tight rein on their tongue deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. That's a sharp one there. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: look after orphans and widows in their distress, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. These are some pretty sharp and hard words. Why? Why is he being so mean? Is James a jerk?
Well, I would assume because he's experienced it in the people he's working with.
Or maybe within himself.
And
Yeah,
himself.
right? Maybe even with himself. What we say, even offhandedly, can do more damage than almost anything we realize. How many comments have we carried for years? Do you have anything? I don't want you to tell me, but did somebody ever say something when you were a child? Or 10 years ago, some cutting comment, some criticism, some dismissal of you that has stuck with you? Because the scary, horrible, painful truth is, if there was a way to ask that person, do you remember what you said to me? Almost invariably, the answer is no. Or, I didn't say that. Or, oh my gosh, I didn't even mean it. It just sort of, if I said that, it's kind of like how we assume if we're in a crowd and we stumble and we trip, that everybody's looking at us and everybody's making fun of us.
Yeah.
Nobody cares and nobody noticed, but our brains they're off to the races that we've suffered this humiliation that people are going to go home and talk about for years. Oh, old stumble and fall over there. You know, what a big klutz they are. Like, nobody noticed. What I'm saying is not that our brains are blowing stuff out of proportion. I'm saying that even a stray comment, if it hits us at the wrong place and at the wrong time, can leave a wound that will ooze blood for a lifetime. How careful should we be then, realizing our stray words could do that to somebody else? Pure and faultless religion, caring for the most vulnerable and not being polluted by the world. More than any of the other stuff that he could list. And he could list our, whatever, all sorts of things.
Straight,
Straight your crown just a little, yeah. And we can spend a lot of time, majoring on the minors and taking care of all the little details. But ultimately, will you care for the most vulnerable? And do you look more like the rest of the world, or do you look more like Jesus? And I think it's not for nothing that looking more like the rest of the world is connected to this concept of pollution. What is pollution other than waste or refuse or something that is toxic, that is spoiling something natural and good? And maybe don't swim in the toxic sludge. And maybe stay away from the junkyard.
Don't drink the water at Camp Lejeune.
And don't and don't drink the water. Right. Okay, we good for chapter 1?
yes,
All right.
thank you.